What was supposed to be a light, friendly morning show appearance turned into one of the most uncomfortable moments daytime television had seen in years. From the instant Eddie Murphy walked onto the View set, the atmosphere felt charged, though no one could quite explain why. He arrived with his trademark warmth, smiling easily, greeting the hosts with the calm confidence of a man who had spent more than 4 decades at the top of the entertainment world. Whoopi Goldberg, Sarah Hines, and the rest of the panel welcomed him genuinely, clearly excited to have a legend in their presence. Eddie took his seat relaxed and professional. The conversation began exactly as expected. He spoke passionately about his latest project, sharing behind-the-scenes stories that had the audience laughing. His charisma filled the studio effortlessly, reminding everyone why his name still carried so much weight. Across generations, he talked about creativity, about the magic of storytelling, about the joy of making people laugh. Sarah nodded in admiration. Whoopi smiled knowingly. The energy was warm, respectful, exactly what a press tour stop should be. Then the tone shifted. Joy Behar, who had been unusually quiet, leaned forward. Her expression hardened. The warmth evaporated in an instant. She interrupted the flow of the conversation and redirected it sharply, dragging Eddie S. past into the present. The question wasn't curious, it was confrontational. The studio felt it immediately. Eddie's smile faded, replaced by controlled surprise. The other hosts exchanged uneasy glances. Sensing the sudden danger in the room, Eddie remained composed, answering calmly at first. But Joy pressed harder. What began as commentary quickly turned into accusation. Accountability, apologies, past material judged by modern standards. Whoopi attempted to redirect. Sarah tried to soften the moment. Joy refused to let go. Eddie straightened in his chair. The easygoing legend disappeared, replaced by a man defending a lifetime of work. His voice stayed steady, but the edge was unmistakable. Now he spoke about comedy as art, about context, about growth without erasure, about how pushing boundaries was never comfortable, but always necessary. Joy pushed back louder, now sharper. The tension thickened. The audience grew silent. The hosts shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Then Eddie turned the conversation around. He challenged the double standard. He challenged the selective outrage. He challenged the idea that one person could sit in judgment while pretending neutrality. The balance of power shifted instantly. Joy faltered. The smirk vanished. Defensiveness replaced certainty. Her words stumbled as Eddie's clarity sharpened. Years of experience, criticism, and survival poured into his voice. This was no longer an interview. It was a reckoning. Attempts to calm things down failed. Eddie was done playing along. The confrontation escalated rapidly. Accusations of ambush, of hypocrisy, of virtue signaling disguised as concern. The studio felt like it was holding its breath. And then Eddie stood. The movement alone froze the room. His voice dropped, controlled and dangerous in its quiet intensity. He spoke about respect, about deception, about being invited under false pretenses, about the harm of public humiliation disguised as moral superiority. Joy tried to minimize it. That only made it worse. Eddie exploded not with chaos but with precision. Every word landed heavy. The producers panicked behind the cameras. The audience sat stunned, witnessing a side of Eddie Murphy rarely seen. Unfiltered, uncompromising, unafraid. He spoke about fatigue, the exhaustion of constantly having to justify art, intent, and legacy. about refusing to calm down when disrespect had become normalized, about the damage done when conversations are weaponized instead of shared. Joy had no answer left. The energy in the studio shifted from tension to realization. This wasn't a comedian losing control. This was a master defending his life's work against someone who had misjudged him entirely. The interview was beyond saving. What remained was a moment raw, uncomfortable, unforgettable, that revealed just how quickly respect can disappear and how dangerous it is to mistake silence for weakness. And Joy Behar learned in real time that Eddie Murphy was not the man to ambush on live television. The silence that followed Eddie's last words was deafening. For a few seconds, no one spoke. No one moved. Even the studio audience, normally restless whispering, reacting, sat frozen, as if afraid that any sound might shatter what had just happened. The air felt heavy, charged with something far bigger than a TV disagreement. This was ego versus legacy, agenda versus authenticity. Joy sat stiffly in her chair, lips pressed tight, eyes darting briefly toward the producers behind the cameras. The confidence she had entered the confrontation with was gone. In its place was the unmistakable realization that she had lost control of the narrative, and worse, the room. Whoopi cleared her throat, attempting to regain her footing as moderator. She had seen tense moments before. She had seen clashes. But this was different. This wasn't performative outrage or playful sparring. This was personal. Eddie remained standing, shoulders squared, breathing measured. He wasn't yelling anymore. He need to the room was already listening. I came here to talk about creativity. He continued, his voice firm but grounded. I came here to talk about storytelling, about making people feel something real, not to be dragged into a public trial where the verdict was decided before I even sat down. He gestured around the set, not angrily, almost disappointed. This right here, he said. This is what happens when conversation stops being about understanding and starts being about scoring points. Joy attempted to interject, but Eddie held up a hand, not aggressively, just decisively. No, let me finish. That alone was enough to stop her. For 40 years, Eddie went on, I've stood on stages in front of cameras, in front of audiences who came from every background imaginable. People laughed together, people who didn't agree on politics, culture, or anything else that mattered. It still matters. He paused, letting the words settle. And now he said quietly, we act like the goal is to tear that down. To comb through the past, looking for reasons to cancel joy instead of understanding growth. Sarah Haynes nodded sadly, clearly moved but unsure how to step in. The other hosts avoided eye contact, caught between loyalty to their colleague and the undeniable truth unfolding in front of them. Joy finally spoke again, her voice noticeably restrained. I think you're taking this too personally. Eddie turned toward her slowly. That is the problem, he said. You think this isn't personal? He let out a short, humorless laugh. When you reduce someone's life work to a checklist of offenses, when you demand apologies instead of dialogue, when you ambush instead of invite, that is personal, whether you admit it or not. Another long pause. The producers were desperately signaling for a commercial break now. But even they seemed unsure whether cutting away would only make things worse. The moment had already escaped the boundaries of television formatting. Eddie glanced briefly at Whoopi. I respect you, he said. You know that, and I respect conversation when it's honest. Then he looked back at Joy. But I want to sit here, and be lectured by someone who confuses moral superiority with insight. Joy's jaw tightened. She said nothing. Eddie took a breath, the intensity finally easing. Not because he was backing down, but because he had said what needed to be said. This industry, he concluded, doesn't survive on fear. It survives on courage, on risk, on people willing to speak even when it's uncomfortable. And I want to apologize for being one of those people. He nodded once more to the audience, then to the hosts. Thank you, and with that, Eddie Murphy walked off the set. The cameras lingered awkwardly. Whoopi stared after him, shaking her head slowly, fully aware that what had just happened would be replayed, dissected, debated for weeks. Sarah looked stunned. Joy sat rigid, staring straight ahead, knowing the moment had slipped beyond spin or explanation. The audience didn't tea-clap. They didn't tea-boo. They simply watched, because they had just witnessed something rare and unscripted. Collision between power, ego, and truth. A reminder that respect, once broken, can't be edited out in post-production. And by the time the show finally cut to commercial, one thing was clear: this wasn't just an interview gone wrong. It was a moment that exposed how fragile civil conversation becomes when one side walks in ready to attack, and how dangerous it is to underestimate a man who knows exactly who he is and what he has built. The commercial break finally hit, but the damage was already irreversible. Behind the scenes, the studio erupted into controlled chaos. Producers rushed toward their headsets, voices overlapping, trying to figure out how to salvage what had just unfolded. Live in front of millions, assistants whispered urgently. Stage managers avoided eye contact. No one quite knew what to say, because no one could undo it. On set, the host sat in heavy silence. Whoopi leaned back in her chair, rubbing her temple slowly. She had moderated heated debates before, but this felt different. This wasn't an ideological disagreement. This was a breakdown of trust. Sarah stared down at her notes, unreadable now, the planned questions suddenly meaningless. Joy remained stiff, arms crossed tightly, her face locked into a forced neutrality that fooled no one. When the cameras came back on, the energy had shifted completely. Whoopi tried to steady the moment, addressing the audience with practiced professionalism. Well, that was a passionate conversation, she said carefully, choosing every word like it might explode. Sometimes these discussions bring out strong emotions. But even she knew it sounded hollow. Viewers at home weren't hearing passion. They were seeing something else entirely. A line crossed, a guest blindsided. A confrontation that never needed to happen. Backstage, Eddie stood alone for a moment, breathing deeply. The anger had faded, replaced by something quieter, resolve. Wasn't he shaken? Wasn't he regretful, if anything? He felt clarity. He had spent his entire career navigating criticism, evolving without erasing himself, learning when to listen and when to stand firm. And this had been one of those moments where standing firm was the only option. A staff member approached, cautiously offering water, apologizing under their breath. Eddie nodded politely. He wasn't interested in apologies. The point had already been made. Outside, the studio phones were already lighting up. Clips were being uploaded. Headlines were being drafted in real time. Social media erupted with split-second opinions, some praising Eddie's composure and conviction, others scrambling to defend Joy's framing. But one thing was undeniable. No one was indifferent. This was the background noise television. This was a moment. By the end of the day, the narrative had escaped the show entirely. Commentators dissected body language. Tone shifts the exact second the interview derailed. Some called it brave. Others called it reckless. But even critics had to admit one uncomfortable truth. Eddie Murphy had refused to be reduced, and that refusal resonated. Fans revisited his work with fresh perspective. Comedians spoke up quietly, then loudly about the danger of rewriting history without context. Others debated accountability, growth, and whether modern outrage had begun replacing genuine conversation. Joy, meanwhile, released a carefully worded statement. It spoke of important discussions, challenging topics, and strong emotions. It didn't mention ambush. It didn't mention agenda. It didn't mention the look on her face when the power shifted, and didn't come back. Inside the industry, the reaction was more telling. Invitations were reconsidered. Producers asked harder questions, not of guests but of themselves. How far was too far? When did conversation turn into confrontation? And who really benefited when it did? As for Eddie, he moved on. He always had, but something lingered in the public consciousness, a reminder that legends aren't just defined by the laughter they create, but by the moments they refuse to shrink. That respect isn't automatic, but it is non-negotiable. And that authenticity, once cornered, doesn't disappear. It pushes back. That morning show had expected promotion. What it got was history. Not because voices were raised, but because one man refused to let his legacy be rewritten by someone who mistook a platform for authority. And long after the episode faded from the schedule, one thing remained painfully clear. When respect leaves the room, truth has a way of standing up. In the days that followed, the moment refused to fade. The clip replayed everywhere, cut slowed down, analyzed frame by frame. Comment sections turned into battlegrounds. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to it. Media outlets tried to reshape it into something easier to digest. But the raw truth resisted simplification. Because this wasn't he really about Eddie Murphy. And it wasn't he really about Joy Behar. It was about what happens when conversation turns into prosecution. Inside industry circles, the reaction was quieter but heavier. Writers, comedians, and performers spoke privately, at first admitting something many had been afraid to say out loud. They recognized themselves in Eddie's position, the fear of being invited into a space under the promise of dialogue, only to discover it was a setup. The pressure to apologize, not for intent, not for harm proven, but for survival. For decades, comedy had been about risk, about walking into discomfort with the hope that laughter might open people up instead of shutting them down. Now many wondered if the risk had become too one-sided. Eddie's stand had cracked something open. Not a movement, not a rebellion. A question: was accountability still about growth, or had it become about power? Joy, meanwhile, tried to move forward on air. She carried on with her usual confidence. But something had shifted. Viewers noticed it. There was a restraint that hadn't even there before. A subtle defensiveness beneath the sharpness. She avoided direct references to the incident, but the absence spoke louder than acknowledgement ever could. Because deep down she knew she hadn't lost an argument. She had lost control. Eddie, on the other hand, never revisited the moment publicly. No victory lap. No follow-up interviews. No social media posts. That silence wasn't avoidance. It was authority. He didn't need to explain himself again. The moment had already spoken. At his next public appearance, the applause lasted longer than usual. Not louder, longer. The kind of applause that isn't just admiration but recognition. People weren't cheering a comedian. They were acknowledging a man who refused to be rewritten. Back on The View, the episode quietly disappeared from promotional rotations. No best moments clip. No anniversary callback. It became one of those broadcasts everyone remembered, but no one officially celebrated, and yet it lingered in classrooms discussing media ethics. In green rooms before interviews. In writers' rooms debating what could still be said and how the moment became a reference point. Remember what happened to Eddie, a warning, a reminder, a line in the sand. Because what that morning revealed wasn't he just conflicted, exposed fragility, the fragility of platforms built on civility, that collapse the moment respect disappears. The fragility of conversations that claim openness while punishing disagreement. And above all, it revealed something timeless. Legends don't crumble when challenged. They clarify. Eddie Murphy didn't walk onto that set intending to make a statement. He intended to talk about art, creativity, laughter. But when pushed into a corner built from assumptions and accusations, he chose truth over comfort. And that choice echoed far beyond a single episode. Long after the lights dimmed, the cameras shut off and the audience went home. One truth remained undeniable. You can question a man's work. You can debate his choices. But when you strip away respect, don't be surprised when dignity stands up and refuses to sit back down.